masculine word. And we're going to see in a minute, particularly in our next text, that it's often used in connection with a whole cluster of other words that also talk about mercy. And I think Dr. Lombardi last week mentioned the word rachum, mercy, which is another term for mercy, which actually comes from a root related to womb. So it's drawing on a slightly different metaphor. But this word chesed that we see in this psalm is a word that's very closely linked. It comes from the whole milieu of covenant. When we talk about God making a covenant with Israel, we're then, drawing on this metaphor that was very common in the ancient world of a treaty or an agreement, usually between a more powerful king and a weaker person, a vassal, who entered into a particular agreement. And what is important in a covenant is that both sides take on obligations. The major party has to do certain things, and the weaker party takes on certain obligations. And of course, in the Old Testament, we'll look at a passage from Exodus in just a moment. This is God making a covenant and giving his commandments, his laws, as the obligations. But God also enters into an obligation. And chesed is the particular word that's used to describe this mutual obligation that binds both parties. So that's what steadfast love is trying to capture, some of that idea. So let's look a minute at how these words come together in our second passage. And this is the passage from the book of Exodus. So this is, of course, one of the books we're more familiar with. The whole description of bringing the people out of Egypt, crossing the Red Sea, taking them to Mount Sinai, which is then the description where God enters into this covenant with the people, gives them their terms of the covenant, the 10 Commandments. The people say, all of the words that you have said to us, we will do. They take on this obligation. Now, this passage that we're looking at tonight comes from closer to the very end of the book, when after the people have sinned, we'll come back to this, God, as it were, renews this covenant. So the Lord descended in the cloud and stood with Moses there. The Lord passed by him and proclaimed, the Lord, the Lord. So this is God's own name. He's saying, I, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love, in chesed and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love, keeping chesed for the thousands of generations, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, by no means clearing the guilty, but visiting the iniquity of parents upon their children and the children's children to the third and fourth generation. So this is one of the passages that combines both mercy and punishment. God brings both of these together, but begins with this description of a God merciful and gracious, abounding in steadfast love. I don't know, is that a familiar passage to most of you? I wish I could talk to you as we do this. One of the reasons I think is because it's repeated so many times in the Old Testament. Just to give a few examples, it's taken up and used in the Psalms. So, Psalm 103, Notice how close the language is the same. The Lord is merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love. He will not always accuse, nor will he keep his anger forever. Or Psalm 145, the Lord is gracious and merciful, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love. You notice how that just is a refrain that's repeated in a number of the Psalms. And then it's taken up in the prophets. The prophet Joel. This is the reading that we have for Ash Wednesday as we began Lent. If you think back, you heard this reading probably. Return to the Lord your God, for he is gracious and merciful, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, and relents from punishing. Or think about the book of Jonah, which takes up this phrase also. Remember when God sends Jonah to preach repentance to the Ninevites, and Jonah flees off in the opposite direction. And he says, for I knew that you are a gracious God and merciful, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, and ready to relent from punishing. And just one last example from one of the last books of the Old Testament, from Nehemiah, when the people are praying after they've come back from exile and they acknowledge their sin. Our ancestors acted presumptuously and stiffened their neck and did not obey your commandments. But you are a God ready to forgive, gracious and merciful, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love. And you did not forsake them. So this is a very important series of phrases within the Old Testament. It became used, almost as a confession of faith. This is what God is: gracious and merciful, slow to forgive. In Jewish tradition, I just put a note there. These verses are called the 13 attributes of God. If you put all the uses of this together and add them up, you come up with about 13 uses of these verses. And they're still recited today in Jewish liturgy in very special prayers of penitence on the Day of Atonement. So it's a very living tradition in the Jewish world. So if we go back to the original context that we had there in Exodus, remember we said this was after God had made his covenant with Israel. But remember the story that immediately then the people turned from God. And right before this is coming right after the chapter about the making of the golden calf. When God then, his anger is inflamed against the people. But then Moses prays and pleads. And God says, Exodus says in chapter 32, verse 14, God changes his mind about the disaster he had planned to bring upon the people. And why? Well, here God is explaining, because this is who I am as God. A God who will punish, but whose punishment is within this framework of one who is gracious and merciful. And notice here we use this other word, along with chesed, we use this word rachum, which is much more an emotive term. So it's calling now not just on the more legal covenant, God is obliged to his people, but he also has the emotion of a mother with her child. This is the example, there's the passage, that word that Isaiah uses. Can a mother forget her nursing child, or show no compassion for the child of her womb? Yet even if these forget, I will not forget you. And so that's a really bold metaphor, because God's comparing his relationship to us to that of a nursing mother and her child. I mean, there's a mother can't forget her breasts that are full of milk. There's a real, again, this physicality. This is what binds God. And then this language can be taken up in the Psalms as a father has compassion, rachum, for his children. So the Lord has compassion on those who fear him. So Pope Francis describes this as a visual love, a love that gushes forth from the depths. And so you can see how then this can be taken up in all of these different passages as a source of consolation, but not always, because remember, Jonah gets very, very angry because God is so merciful. He says, this isn't quite how it's supposed to be. And God says to Jonah, is it right that you should get so angry? And Jonah just doesn't give in. He says, literally in Hebrew, he says, angry enough to die. And remember, he goes out and sits under the plant as it withers up. So the mercy of God is not only a consolation, but it's also a challenge. Because we're talking about a mercy that really extends beyond human comprehension, or beyond human logic, certainly. And that's what I'm going to conclude with, our final passage here from Hosea chapter 11. And here we have a passage again in poetry in which God himself is speaking. So the prophet presents this in God's own voice. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. So the language is the language of a parent and a child. And I say parent particularly because there's been a lot of discussion, going back even to the rabbis, about whether the image here is a father and a son or a mother and a son. And in a sense, the text is very careful. It's both. And it doesn't limit it to one or the other. But he says, Israel was a child, I loved him. He goes back and again recalls the history. Out of Egypt, I called my son, but the more I called them, the more they went away from me. They kept sacrificing to the Baals, the pagan gods, and offering incense to idols. So the people have sinned. They've turned away from the very obligations that they took on themselves under the covenant. And according to logic, according to what a covenant is, in juridical terms, this is the time for punishment, and the covenant should come to an end. It's broken. It no longer has to be kept. But instead of that, God goes back, and he goes back to this image of a child. They went away, they sacrificed to the pagan gods, yet it was I who taught Ephraim to walk. I took them up in my arms, but they did not know that it was I that led them. I led them with cords of human kindness, with bands of love. I was like those who lift infants to their cheeks. I bent down and I fed them. So again, this image of a parent and a child. But then it goes on and talks about, yes, there will be punishment. They shall return to the land of Egypt. And Israel and Assyria, this great mighty power, will be over them as a king. Because they have refused to return to me, the sword rages against their cities. And I left out a couple of verses that talk, again, in the terms of the punishment that would come in terms of exile and defeat in war, which is the classical way in the Old Testament, punishment is described. And just when we think that God is going to say, this is the end, he comes back with questions. But how can I give you up, O Ephraim? How can I hand you over, O Israel? How can I make you like Adam and treat you like Zeboim, 2 cities that were destroyed in the book of Deuteronomy? My heart recoils within me. My compassion, my rachum, grows warm and tender. So the heart is the place then of God's decision, his will. The translation here, it recoils within me. It doesn't quite capture the phrase. It really says in Hebrew, my heart is stirred up within me, turned upside down. So he's talking about emotion, wrestling, turmoil, and change. Because then God, as it were, comes to a decision. I will not execute my fierce anger. I will not again destroy Ephraim. For I am God and no mortal, the Holy One in your midst, and I will not come in wrath. So with this statement, we're really led right into the mystery of what does it mean to be God? God's otherness, God's holiness is disclosed not in the exercise of wrath or just anger, but in withholding anger. And Pope Francis, in commenting on this passage, uses the words of St. Augustine. Augustine said, it is easier for God to hold back anger than to hold back mercy. And then Francis quotes St. Thomas Aquinas. It is proper for God to exercise mercy, and God manifests his power, his omnipotence in this way. So for Thomas, mercy is an exercise of God's might, of God's mercy is strength and not weakness. And Pope Francis ends by recalling one of the most ancient collects, the opening prayers that we use in the church's liturgy. The prayer begins, O God, who reveals your power, above all in mercy and forgiveness. So I think by meditating on a passage like this, perhaps particularly Hosea 9, we're led very deeply into the mystery of our God. A mystery that's revealed in the Old Testament and then leads us to Jesus Christ, the face of God's mercy. So I think I'm going to end this here. I hope it's given us something to think about, and we can see if we have any questions.